poor 8-year-old girl was tortured by her mum and dad. She was restrained and beaten. She desperately tried to escape, so much so that she actually tore her nails from the fingers while trying to get away. In the quiet town of Elk River, Minnesota, the air in autumn is usually crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and the promise of a long winter. But in 2020, behind the doors of an unremarkable apartment, the atmosphere was thick with something far more sinister. This is the story of Autumn Lee Hallow, an 8-year-old girl whose life was extinguished not by a stranger in the woods, but by the very people sworn to protect her. On the afternoon of the 13th of December, police were called to a home where they found a scene that would haunt the seasoned officers for years. Autumn was discovered in a bath. Her body was cold, her skin rigid. She was profoundly underweight. Her frame so skeletal that her hip bones and ribs protruded sharply against her skin. She weighed just 3 stone. The investigation quickly shifted from a medical emergency to a homicide inquiry, focusing on her father, Brett Hallow, and her stepmother, Sarah Hallow. What emerged was a portrait of systematic, ritualised torture. The details are difficult to hear. Neighbours would later testify to hearing screams, high-pitched, desperate cries, and the sound of banging against walls. This was the sound of Autumn being restrained. According to court documents, Autumn was frequently tied up with clothes and belts, her hands bound behind her back to prevent her from resisting or even feeding herself. The physical abuse was relentless. When the medical examiner performed the autopsy, the findings were a map of unthinkable cruelty. Autumn had suffered extensive pinched bruising, consistent with being gripped with extreme force. There were hemorrhages in her brain and blood in her lungs. Most chillingly, her fingers were bloody and her nails were missing, evidence of her desperate clawing attempts to escape her restraints. The motive, if you can call it that, was a perverse desire for control. Sarah and Brett had isolated Autumn from her biological mum, using the COVID-19 pandemic as a shield to hide the girl's deteriorating condition from teachers and relatives. They treated her not as a child, but as a prisoner. They claimed she was disobedient, using her supposed behavioural issues to justify punishments that escalated into fatal violence. On the day she died, it's believed Autumn was forced into the bathroom where a physical confrontation occurred. The trauma to her head suggests she was struck or slammed against a hard surface before being placed in the water. By the time the 911 call was placed, Autumn had been dead for some time. The rigor mortis found by first responders suggested that the Hallows had waited to call for help, perhaps trying to concoct a story that would save them. In 2021, Brett and Sarah pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. They were sentenced to just 40 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the plea agreement. But for the community of Elk River, the sentence offered little solace. Autumn Lee Hallow was a child who slipped through every crack in the system, a girl whose light was snuffed out in a cold bath, while the world outside continued to turn. She remains a harrowing reminder of the darkness that can thrive in silence and the bravery required to look behind closed doors.